Are we live? Are we there? Hey, everybody. Well, what a strange week. That's all I have to say. A strange week. I'm here with Garrett at my house instead of being at the church tonight because of icy bridges and most of the roads I was out and about today. Excuse me. And most of the roads are pretty good shape up here in Freeport, except going out toward Bruce. It was a little dicey. I can hear myself. Where's that echo coming from? It's Mom watching. Cindy's watching in the other room. You may see Cindy or Braden make an appearance, or another house guest. Connor lives with us. Mo just left my office here. Garrett, how are you? You going to unmute yourself back there? Yeah. Say hello. Garrett muted himself because he's pilfering our kitchen with the pepperonis and crackers and pizza
and Wisconsin cheese.
Wisconsin cheese from Jeff Allen. And,
thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff and Sue, for that. Appreciate that. You are deprived tonight of your quiz, the always illustrious quiz to get you started. But if you will look at the PDF upload that Garrett put up about a half an hour ago, I think, on A Simple Faith's page, the quiz is there with all the answers, since I couldn't quiz you tonight. So I hope you enjoy that. And this sort of feels like going back to the, maybe too soon, Jeff, going back to COVID world, because we did this on Sundays upstairs in my home, and then we did these Q&As on Wednesday evenings during COVID. Garrett is watching right here with me. He's sitting on a couch across from me, and he'll be fielding all the questions. So if you have questions tonight, please put those in the comment section. Thank you again, Jeff. Jeff says we're welcome for the cheese, and Garrett is eating it all. So hey, Jane McCauley, hey, David Miller, Jeff Allen, Denise Thompson, Leslie Pennell, Leslie Lee, Kurt Tate, Cindy Cooper McBrayer, Trinity Paul, Judy Russell, David Beavers, on and on and on it goes. So thanks for joining us tonight. And we are going to be working on Genesis 3, 4, and 5. And once again, I'll make a couple of clarifications as we get started, like I did last week, and answer a few questions that came into me after the session. Garrett, do you have any questions before we begin? Since you're the master of questions, are there any already landing? Okay, he's giving me the head nod. There's Kim Paul, Kevin Allen, Lori Gayton, Pam Walker, Keith Marika, Raina Anderson, I believe I saw Judy Rutland, Chip Harrington. All right, excellent. So clarification number one, if you go to that first slide, or it's actually slide 2, I guess it would be. This is Sir Austin Henry Layard. He was the discoverer of the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh. I mentioned last week that it was some British explorer, and that's the man right there. He looks a little bit like Robert E. Lee in that picture. He discovered those documents inscribed into stones sometime around 1850, and they were translated in 1876 and published in 1902 by another Englishman, Leonard William King. And so that's for you, Doug Balfour. We couldn't think of who that was last week. Clarification 2, I went back and listened to last week and realized that I misspoke badly on one conversation that I was having with Mickey Brown. He was talking about today's commentaries, and I said that I basically disagreed with 20th century commentaries, and that's not true. The word that I missed in there, besides sounding very arrogant and very flippant, I missed the word traditional. I disagree with the traditional 20th century commentaries, and here is why. The traditional commentaries hold to the medieval view of Genesis 1 through 11, and they have not yet, and may never, have not yet integrated the textual, scientific, the linguistic, and archaeological discoveries of the last 150 years. Slide number 3. I pulled this up for you from a pretty common Bible website, and it's just labeled Bible commentaries. And if you look at that slide on your right, you will see pastoral and easy to read commentaries. And then on your left, you will see the technical or semi-technical commentaries. The technical commentaries, by and large, have made the move to integrate a lot of what I've been talking about for the last few weeks. The pastoral commentaries have not. And there's a couple of reasons why they have not done that. Number one, the publishers of these particular commentaries are committed to, hey, Mo's in here, the little ticky tick sound you might hear as his paws going across my office floor. Hey, buddy. The pastoral commentaries are committed to the medieval view of the book of Genesis. So the view before modern discoveries. And to be honest, a lot of pastors are committed to that view, at least publicly, because to move with the times, to move to a different interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11 would be career suicide. You can't go in, you certainly couldn't go into the churches I grew up in and the first churches I was on staff at and talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh as a parallel text to the book of Genesis. And these pastoral publishers won't publish that stuff for another reason, is it would just blow local houses of worship to pieces. If you have an adult Bible study, or even worse, a youth pastor bringing this subject up to young minds or to young adults, they would fall quickly into conflict with the older, staid theological positions. Garrett, you might want to speak to that. You've been in that position, and might want to talk about that for a second.
Sure. Can you remind me what's your question in particular?
My comment was how it would be career suicide for a lot of pastors to move away from the traditional medieval approach of Genesis and move to the more robust, not
cutting edge,
not better, but certainly more current interpretations and insights.
Yeah, I mean, because you've brought it up a couple different times just over the past 2 weeks, that our traditional line of thinking, the way we've been taught and brought up in the church, is it's hard line. This is what it is. This is our perspective. This is our view, and that's it. To ask questions is, that's it's like you said, career suicide in a lot of ways, especially as a youth, as someone who was in youth ministry for nearly a decade. That just wasn't something you would even consider doing at all. Yeah. I can't even imagine from a pastoral standpoint, from a lead minister's position, because a lot of the stuff is new information. Right. It's and it's hard to wrestle with.
Yeah, and I feel like I can get away with a lot of what I say, because the people at Simple Faith are gracious and curious,
eager. Yeah.
But even then, it's not. I'll get into some of that tonight. Even then, it's not always. People don't know what to do with this information. It is a brand new paradigm for most of us, even though it's not new. It's 100. These changes in the interpretation of Genesis have been going on for 150 years. Mm-hmm. And that really brings me to my third clarification. I am not making this stuff up. I'm relying on solid, deep thinking scholarship, but it's not scholarship based on the medieval model. If you want some of the background I'm using, and I'll also make some recommendations to you about what you can read. I'm using the Christian Standard Bible Commentary, the JPS Torah Exegetical Study. I'm leaning heavily on Walter Brueggemann, at 91 years of age, the greatest American Old Testament scholar to have ever lived. The World Biblical Commentary, English translations of the Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh, Dr. Kathleen O'Connor's commentary, Dr. Martin Palmer, and I'm leaning hard on Jewish interpretations like Dr. Joel Baden from Yale Divinity School, Ron Hindle, who is chair of Jewish Studies at Berkeley, and others. And so my apologies for sounding, flippant last week. Like I just disregard everything. I didn't mean that at all. Misspoke completely. I am disregarding a large extent of the traditional medieval view. They're very good devotionally, but when you get into the technical aspects, they're behind by some decades.
And I think a good question here to ask, even before you move on.
I got to get rid of the dog.
Mo's having a good time here in the office space. But and I know this question was brought up. I think it was last week. Who it was about authorship, and the traditional view is Moses wrote the first 5 books, and you had alluded to, I think it was in session 1, you were talking about the written Hebrew language was around 1000 BCE. Moses was alive around 1500
15 to 1350
so
BC.
By process of elimination, he could not have written it, and that's the point that you were making, is the stories go back to Moses.
Certainly he
Yes.
carries the oral tradition.
But
Absolutely.
Moses could not have written it in the traditional sense of how we think about writing a book.
Right.
And so that's why you had said, Moses did not write these.
Right.
Because it was impossible.
And there are some approachable new commentaries and comments that are out there that will help along some of these lines. I do have a recommendation, and I'll give those to you. Slide 4 there. First of all, I recommend Kathleen O'Connor's commentary on Genesis 1 through 25a. She divides the book in half. Genesis 1 through 11 is its own thing, separate than the rest of the book, and we're as you obviously can tell, we're plowing through that. But her commentary is very good, and it's semi-technical but very readable and very approachable. Full disclosure, her work is printed by Smith and Helwis Publishers. They have been my publisher as well. I get no royalties whatsoever on recommending her book to you. I have a copy of it. It's right over there, and I've been using it daily in this study on Genesis. Dr. O'Connor is a professor of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. Number 2, Genesis for Normal People by Pete Enns, or Peter Enns. Pete Enns' group is actually producing an entire commentary on the Bible for normal people, and it is technical and incorporates discoveries of the last 150 years, but does so very responsibly and fun. Pete Enns has a smashing podcast, The Bible for Normal People. And whenever he tackles a tough subject, he'll say something like, this session is entitled Ruining Genesis for Most Bible Readers, where he takes on the Epic of Gilgamesh or something like that. He has background, I think, at Wheaton and Moody College, and has since moved on to Eastern University, and he's hysterical and easy to read, and you will enjoy him. Number 3, Reading Genesis by Marilyn Robinson. She's not a scholar. She's actually a novelist. And this is a layman's approach to wrestling with the book of Genesis, and I recommend it. It's worth your time. And then to push the edges for you a little bit more, Stephen Greenblatt, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, wrote not too long ago, The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve. And he gets in, has a Jewish Hebrew education, and he gets into the background of that from that perspective. And it's not a theological work either, but it's super, super interesting, and so I recommend that to you. That was a question about recommended reading. Question number 2, is it necessary to know the extensive background of Genesis to properly understand it? Absolutely not. That's the beauty of the Bible, is that it meets people where they are, and there is something to gain simply by reading it. And I would say that our theological ancestors got a whole lot out of reading the Genesis account before many of these discoveries were made. and it shaped them and formed them. And none of us will ever be completely, totally, and supremely informed on the background of the Bible. Short answer is no. Now, you do have to, I think, to get the most out of Genesis, you do have to commit yourself to a bit of cross-cultural studies. And there's a saying that goes, the past is a foreign country. They do things different back there. And we have to be aware of that when we're studying the book of Genesis. Question number 3, how many names for God are there in the Bible? I think I said 50 last week. I was aiming at the middle. There's probably more than 100 titles assigned to God, though I wouldn't call each of those individual names. God of hope, God of peace. But here are the main names for God. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, half a dozen of them here. El is very generic. It can be used of God even with the little g, a God or gods. It can be either. Elohim is a bit more proper. Elohim can be both singular or plural. El Shaddai is one that I think Christians are pretty familiar with. God Almighty. El Elyon, the God Most High. Adonai, which means Lord. And then God's revealed name to Moses in the Exodus, and again, that all caps, when you see it in English, is Yahweh or Jehovah, and that's the proper name for God. And then a final question before we get started, and I'll pause for any more questions. This is just a question that I received this week, and I want to read it to you and then reply very briefly to it. The writer says to me, "Shouldn't you? You have put a lot of work into explaining Genesis away. Shouldn't you be honest and say that you don't believe in the Bible?" Well, I really try to not let criticism bother me by not taking it personal. This little dig does bother me. It won't bother me for long. I'll let it go, but it's still bothering me at this moment. And I want to respond by saying to that person and to saying to anybody that's listening, if that is the question you have, you haven't been paying attention. Because I love the Bible, I believe the Bible, I cherish the Bible, I believe the Bible is uniquely inspired, I teach the Bible, that's what I've been doing for 33 years of my life. So just because my conclusions and maybe some of my presuppositions are different than your conclusions and presuppositions doesn't mean that I don't believe the Bible. I probably should just stop right there because I could let that one go for a little bit, but I won't. Are there any questions before we get started into Genesis 3 tonight? I'll pause for just a second. Garrett's giving me any signals? None. All right, good. We're rocking then. I hope you're paying attention out there. Sure, just interrupt me. Let's make some observations about Genesis 3 as we begin. First, and these are characteristic of all the early origin stories that come out of Mesopotamia and the Near East. Human life begins in this idealistic, perfect environment. A common feature in Genesis and the other origin stories, humanity gets, we would say, a rolling start. Everything is perfect around them. One difference is that in the Bible, humans are serving and caring for creation, while in the other origin stories, humans are created so that the lesser gods will have less work to do and won't have to work so hard. So in the Hebrew telling of humanity, humans are God's crowning achievement, the apex of creation. And in the other ancient stories, humans are much more puppet-like, even slaves by comparison. Second, humans are inexplicably put to the test. And when I say inexplicably, that's exactly what I mean. What is God up to? Is a question that Jewish, Christian, Islamic, general linguistic scholars have asked for ages. So you put humanity in a perfect environment, and yet there is still this prohibition there. There's this test here, and you cannot deny it. It is a divine test put to humanity right away. There's no idea to know how long they passed the test. No idea to know how long they lived in the perfect environment before testing the limit, but they certainly tested the limit, as it appears as if God wanted that limit to be at least walked up to test humanity. Another observation, at the end of chapter 3, there is the actual expulsion from Eden. Slide number 6, Garrett. It's Genesis 3:24. The Lord God stationed mighty cherubim to the east of the Garden of Eden, and he placed a flaming sword that flashed back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. This was a means of keeping Adam and Eve from inheriting eternal life after they had come to the knowledge of good and evil. And it's ambiguous in the Hebrew here, and it's hard to tell if the cherubim and the flaming sword are separate things, or if the cherubim has the flaming sword. There are multiple English translations depending on which version of the Bible that you read. Cherubim is an interesting creature, to say the least. Ezekiel gives a description of the cherubim, these angelic beings, and they don't look like anything like of what we would imagine angels to be. They're fearsome, they're monstrous, they're terrifying combinations of human, winged bulls, lions, eagles. And on the slide there before you, that is an Assyrian statue, I think, that helps a whole lot. That's called a lamassu. It's a common creature in the ancient culture, and if you look at it there, it has the face and head of a human being and the body of a bull or a lion and the wings of an eagle, and these are all over the place in ancient Mesopotamia. This one in particular is in the Louvre in France, and they're usually at holy sites, palaces, gates as you enter into a city. And a lot of scholars would say that the biblical use of the word cherubim matches something like what you see in that picture right there. For all the early stories, Genesis, the Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the others, they all have talking animals. We have talking animals in our culture of English fairy tales and English stories that teach our kids. It's a standard literary device. And most of the early origin stories give top billing, you guessed it, to a talking snake, to a serpent, as it is here in Genesis chapter 3. Now, our Christian minds, formed by centuries of theology, immediately identify the serpent as the devil. The text, if you read it, never implies even such a thing. Theologians will do it later, but not at the time of the writing of the book of Genesis. The talking, tempting, sneaky snake is just that, a talking, tempting, sneaky snake. And no more meaning was ascribed to it. In fact, the devil, and that phrase devil, that name, that title, isn't even used in the Old Testament at all. Nowhere. It's a New Testament word. Diabolos is the Greek word for the devil, the accuser. It's much more of a judicial term, a legal term in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, the Hebrews used the word Satan, specifically the Satan. Not a proper name, but a noun. This was an adversary or the adversary or a tempter. Not a proper name. And even then, you may find this amazing, particularly if you were raised Baptist like I was, and the devil was everywhere on every page of Scripture. Satan is only used 4 times in the entire Old Testament. In 1 Chronicles 21, throughout the book of Job, Psalm 109, and Zechariah 3. That's it. There is not a developed concept of Satan or the devil, this horned creature with a pitchfork and wearing a red jumpsuit. Now, all that came later. That came in the Middle Ages after the bubonic plague. That's really where the theology of the devil got its due. Martin Palmer simply calls the Satan, Satan, as the force against goodness. And you would see later, much later, in Revelation chapter 12, that's the first time that you see the devil or Satan connected to the image of a snake or a serpent. So very, very late, even in Christian writing, before that correlation is made. And that's going to bring us to interpretations of the fall, but we may have questions first. Is anybody still out there, still awake? No questions? All right. Garrett, were you when you were you did the Bible college thing and the seminary thing, was the exact same path I did. I mean, I did university studies the first few years, but then graduated Bible college and then on to seminary. So it's which is a different kind of education than a liberal arts or a technical education. So it's very, very, Bible heavy.
Yeah.
Did y'all ever deal with the devil much, or was it just this dude that was out there?
I mean, I could probably make some jokes about that. Did we ever deal with the devil much? Yes. It was secular people out there. All those other people, they're just all Satan. Yeah. No, I'm kidding. We never really, from what I can remember, dove into that topic. We never really talked about it much. Our particular background was, more biblical interpretation, how to teach the Bible well.
Yeah.
We didn't always dive into these particulars, especially Satan.
We didn't either.
But Satan was taught the idea of Satan was taught in a way, and you and I have had this conversation, driving to and fro all over the place. Satan was almost godlike, almost omnipresent, almost omniscient, almost, in a lot of ways, very much how we would describe God. Yeah. He's everywhere. And he's always tempting you.
Yeah.
And it's always his fault.
Yeah, I did get in trouble once with a professor about that very thing that I said. I asked my professor if the devil was omniscient and omnipresent. Oh, of course not.
Yeah.
Only God's omnipresent. And I said, well, what do you say about people, who say, the devil's tempting me, and well, the devil is. And I said, well, if there's, at the time, 7 million people on this planet, the devil sure gets around
very quickly,
because I did the calculation at the time, and the devil gets like 1/2 of 1 second per person in the course of 30 years or something, because I was just being a jerk, but trying to get to that very, very point. I saw that Caden made a comment here that the word for snake used is also the name of a Babylonian god that Marduk overthrew. That is correct in many of the sources. And Caden Edwards, you beautiful person, it is also related to the Hebrew word seraph, where Hebrew gets the name for seraphim, which is very interesting. I don't have time to get into that tonight, but the burning one, the shining one. So there's a relationship there that the snake was not something ugly. In fact, the text calls it the most shrewd, the smartest. It was like set apart from all the other animals. It was a beautiful, brilliant, burning, shining, angelic-like thing, a lower god, you would say, in the Mesopotamian culture. And then I see, was there an actual Adam and Eve? I'm going to talk about that coming up next, so I'm going to get to that question as we talk about the interpretations of the fall. All right, there are, on slide 7, 4 leading interpretations of Genesis chapter 3 as it relates to the fall of humanity, as it relates to what Christianity calls original sin. We have an allegorical view, which is held largely by the Jewish community and by some Christians. We have the Augustinian view, which is a a Roman Catholic doctrine and Reformed Protestants hold an Augustinian view. There is an Aquinian view named after Thomas Aquinas, which is you could say that it's an Augustinian view that's been revisited and revised. And I would say, and I'll get to this, that I think many evangelical churches have, if they're not Reformed, have an Aquinian view of original sin. And then there is the ancestral view, which traditionally has been held by the Eastern Orthodox Church. So we're going to talk about all of these in the next 20 minutes here and try to make some time. There is a question. I thought the devil was a fallen angel. Good question. It's not in the text. It's in the Apocrypha. The devil, Satan, is mentioned more in the apocryphal books, and that's a collection of about a dozen books that did not make it into the final canon. It's all about the devil and Satan, but it was not deemed worthy of making it into the canon by those who put the New Testament or the Old Testament together. Good question, Sarah. All right, to the allegoric view, which is primarily began as a Jewish interpretation of the fall. You can actually move to that next slide number 8. The summary of it is that the fall is a parable-like story about the nature of being human, about the maturation process of growing up, whereby each person will grow to the point of having moral and ethical freedom and will choose between good and evil. But it is allegorical. Contemporary Jewish teachers are not dogmatic about this. You will find some contemporary Jewish teachers who take Adam and Eve as literal beings, and you will find some that take them as allegorical. This is a story to be told. If you go back to the Middle Ages, Maimonides, who is the leading Jewish rabbi of the Middle Ages, believed that every person has within them all the capacities of God, male, female, spirit, expression, and that the story of the fall is personification of human desire, where Adam is seen as rational, as the thinking part of us, and Eve is seen as the sensing, creative part of us. And the serpent, Maimonides said, is Satan and the world, which attempts to pull from us our fallen angels, our base nature, our lower selves, so that it pollutes the way that we make choices. Some Jewish scholars call this a coming of age story. It simply describes what it means to be a human being. That just as Adam and Eve took of that fruit and then had knowledge of good and evil, we are born into innocence, but at some point in time we mature and reach a certain age where we acquire the ability to determine what is right and what is wrong. And then our choices define ourselves. I was getting at this Sunday when I in my talk on Sunday when I talked about you are the world that you have created. That's a very Jewish Hebrew concept. And within this interpretation, there are some that would hold to an original sin and a literal Adam and Eve, and some that would say no, they're theoretical, they're allegorical. If you look at the bar mitzvah or the bat mitzvah for girls, a bar mitzvah is undertaken at 12 years of age, and it means this child is now subject to the law. That's what a bar mitzvah is. It's not just a party. That they are leaving childhood and moving on to adulthood. They are leaving innocence, and now they are responsible for their own choices. And that is directly related to the Jewish interpretation and some Christian interpretations of the Garden of Eden. It's an allegorical picture of humanity. questions before I move on? All right, we'll move quickly then to the Augustinian interpretation of the fall. And I want to spend a little time here because so much of Western Christianity has been influenced by this. This is the theological position mainly of the Roman Catholic Church, and it's the theological position of Calvinist and the Reform movement. Augustine is named after him, obviously, and I've said many times that Augustine is the most influential theologian ever in the history of Western Christianity, ever. And to this day, so much of our practice and so much of our belief system is related directly to this man. He was the bishop of Hippo from 354. He was born in 354 and died in 430. And he's born at the most opportune time to influence the church. Rome was in trouble. In fact, in his lifetime, in 410, the city of Rome was sacked by German barbarians. The phrase, "there are barbarians at the gate," was coined in 410 when the barbarians overran the city of Rome. First time the city of Rome had ever been overrun or taken in more than 800 years. So it's like a civilization-ending event. And Augustine had to have an explanation for this. How could this have happened to the city of God? How could this have happened to the seat of Simon Peter? What is so wrong with humanity that this happens this way? And so he develops his view and he develops his theology out of the chaos. He needed a robust explanation of the fall to explain the apocalypse around him, and he needed to show in the fall that humans are utterly and completely depraved. He was the first to connect Romans 5, using a very bad Latin translation, to Genesis chapter 3. And while he didn't invent the concept of original sin, he codified it, and he certainly invented the concept of original guilt, original shame. Because you can have theories of Genesis 3 and theories of original sin that have original sin without original guilt. But Augustine's is not the place to go to look for that. His main point is that humanity is totally depraved. Now, you may not be as depraved as you could be, but you are absolutely corrupt, and it is incapable for you to find salvation on your own. And this depravity, speaking frankly now, is passed on human to human in the male semen. And this is why the importance of the virgin birth becomes so important in the after Augustine. The doctrine of Mary's immaculate conception becomes very important. The baptizing of babies to wash away the original sin. And Augustine was cruel on this count, saying that if a baby was unbaptized, it went to hell forever, period. The reaction was so strong against this that others, for all practical purposes, invented limbo, a place for the unbaptized babies to go that was neither heaven nor hell. Pope John Paul in the 1990s got rid of limbo altogether and declared that all babies are innocent and all babies are safe. But for hundreds and hundreds of years, there was this terror that held many people of the Roman Catholic faith over what would happen to an unbaptized baby. And as I said, much of Christian doctrine and practice has developed as it has because of Augustine's view of the fall and his solutions for it. His view requires the development of the sacraments. It requires penal substitution and the like. It requires a literal Adam and Eve. None of this allegory stuff. It requires misogyny, because Augustine blamed Eve primarily for the fall, and it requires this obsession with sex. It requires celibacy for the clergy, and it requires an institutional, powerful church. All that is tied to St. Augustine. And I don't want to make him out to be an evil man or a terrible person, because he has so many redeeming qualities. Truly, at the same time that I've said all of these things, one of the greatest theological minds in history. But he had his own hang-ups with this, and he had his own hang-ups with sexuality. If he were living today, he would be an SA, Sexaholics Anonymous. Even while he was writing the great treatise of the church, he was carrying on an affair with a forbidden lover. And he felt so much shame and disgrace over this, and it bled into his theologies, and it's still in his theologies. Now, John Calvin picked up where Augustine left off. John Calvin was a Protestant, a reformer, who battled the Catholic Church but remained Augustinian in relation to his interpretation of Genesis 3. Whereas Augustine still believed in free will, Calvin got rid of it. That's how he solved the problem of how can we be totally depraved and God still give us free will. And he makes divine determination a part of the story. Predestination. Your life is beyond your will. Everything has already been settled. If God has chosen to save you, you will be saved. If God has chosen to damn you before eternity even began, then you are damned no matter what. And Calvin's massive theological writings, and fair or not, they have been reduced to an acronym. It is the TULIP acronym. Slide 10. You probably already have it up, Garrett. Total. This is what Calvin teaches. Total depravity. Building on Augustine, he goes even further. There is not a single thing about you that has not been untouched by sin. If sin is a pool, you aren't in the water without a life jacket. You're wearing concrete boots at the bottom of the pool. This is original sin and original guilt. You should be ashamed of yourself for being a human. The unconditional election. This is the predestination piece of the puzzle. God chooses by God's will and for God's purposes who are saved, and you are a passive recipient. And if you are not of the elect, you bear God's deserved wrath for all eternity. L is limited atonement. Jesus died for those who will be saved, and only for those who will be saved. His death is inapplicable, useless to those that God has condemned. Jesus' death is sufficient to save everyone, but it is only relevant to those that God has chosen to be saved. I is irresistible grace. You cannot reject God if God has chosen to save you. Again, Calvin is a determinist. Free will does not exist. And then P is perseverance of the saints. If God saves you, you cannot fall away from the faith. Apostasy is impossible. Now, catching my breath here. There are Augustinians who are not Calvinists, as Calvinism is a further developed, even more harsh application of where Augustine began. And if you really want a dose of Calvinism going even further, just go read about the Puritans. Make special note of the Puritans who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony here in North America. John Winthrop, Cotton Mather, the Salem witch trials, and the thorn in their side who began as a Puritan, Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, one of my hero of heroes. And so much of what we called it a Christian nationalism is a 21st century neo-Puritanism. Now, not all Calvinists are Puritans, but there are plenty of Calvinists out there today, and some are more militant than others. And this Augustine view has been incredibly influential on Western Christianity. more so than any doctrine that you could list. And Augustine has been more influential on Western Christianity, be it Catholic or Protestant, than any other single theologian in the history of the church in the last 2,000 years. I'll wait to see if there are any questions out there related to Augustine. Hey, Kurt. Hey, Barbara. Hey, Joyce. Hey, Faye. Hey, Debbie. Good to see y'all joining us.
Now, Mr. Ronnie, just real quickly, as people begin typing madly on their phones and commenting, can you give just a quick excerpt on what their backgrounds were, talking about Augustine and Calvin? Because I think that really shapes their thinking, how they view Scripture, how they view the world, and how things work. Can you just give a blip?
Yeah, Augustine was a wild and rambling young man who, by his own, in his book, in his Confessions, confesses all of his sin. I mean, he is anything at all but forward about his failures. But before he became a Christian and converted to Christianity, he was a Gnostic. That's not a term everybody is familiar with, but it was Gnosticism was very popular in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. It was a Greek movement that basically said all physical material, including this world, including your body, is sinful. That the highest ideal is to be separated from the physical and attain only the spiritual dimension. It's one of the reasons that Paul's preaching of the resurrection of Jesus was so controversial to the Greeks and Romans. Because what Paul was preaching was not, a spirit in the sky. That's a song in it. It was not a spirit in the sky disembodied from the body. He was saying, no, you will have a renewed body. He talked about the physical body of Jesus brought back to life, resurrected, and that was the stumbling block often. And so Augustine began there, but converted to Christianity, and he does bring some of that. He's not a Gnostic. Don't send me hate mail, but he does bring that background with him because he sees the physical relationship between men and women, for example, as being nothing but sinful. It should only be there for procreation. There should be no gratification, no satisfaction in it. And that's more Gnostic than it is Hebrew or Christian. And then Calvin was an attorney. And this is a good place, if you want to kick an attorney, Calvin's Institutes is a massive collection of works, and his theology is very judicial. His theology is very legalistic. And he excelled at that. Another brilliant mind. But it made him very severe. Very severe indeed.
So when you're talking about these two men that have wildly shaped modern Christianity as we have it today, mm-hmm. when they take a look at Genesis 3 through 5, mm-hmm. much of what you just shared shapes how they read that and how they interpret that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it requires a literal Adam and Eve. The Augustine position does. Because Adam, God, this is so hard to say and say it publicly online. Adam's semen is the problem. Garrett's laughing, y'all, right now. He can barely contain himself like a 13-year-old. But that is the problem with Augustinian theology. That's how sin is viewed as being passed along in the human race. There's no way around that. And think about how that has shaped Western Christianity. Particularly if you're, and I'm not throwing stones at Roman Catholicism, but the obsession with the sacrament to make sure that, we can avoid that at all costs. That all goes back to to Augustine 1,600 years ago. So there. I should probably leave that alone right there. Let's move quickly then to the Aquinian interpretation of the fall. And again, I'm speaking of Thomas Aquinas. Slide 11. After Augustine, probably Aquinas is the most influential theologian in the Roman Catholic world. Aquinas lived in the Middle Ages, the 1200s, and while he agreed with Augustine on many counts, he modified original sin. You could say that he even softened it. Aquinas was heavily influenced by Aristotle and the Greeks, and as such, he believed that human reason was a gift from God and could be used to arrive at the truth without relying solely upon divine revelation. And this was a novel idea in the Middle Ages, to say the least. And he brought this to his interpretation of the fall. Yes, human nature is corrupted, he said, but that doesn't mean that we aren't seekers after God. We still seek God. We can still think. We can still choose. We can still act as free moral agents. So Aquinas saw original sin more as a wound or a sickness instead of a death blow, that we are weakened by Adam's sin. We've inherited it for sure, but we can still recognize the divine. We can still be drawn to the truth. Our vision isn't what it should be. Sin has stained us, but in Aquinas there is a lack of original guilt. There's original sin, to be sure, but there's a whole lot less shame. And he did not believe that original sin visited everyone equally. I find that really, really interesting, because he said, isn't it obvious that some people are more depraved than others? That some people give way to the original sin. And he was a very strong proponent of limbo, because he believed that something had to be done for the innocents. He used the term that a person had to come to the age of reason before they could be held responsible for original sin. And Aquinas continues to influence Catherine doctrine and Protestants. Confirmation, for example, serves as the same purpose as a bar mitzvah. Canon law in the Catholic Church states that confirmation should occur between the ages of 7 and 18. And what happens at that point is that an individual has reached the age of reason. They can begin to be responsible for their own choices. Lutherans confirm teenagers about 13 or 14. I think Cindy was confirmed at 13 years of age. I remember growing up in the Baptist church that the ministers talked about, and they may have done this in the Disciples of Christ, Garrett, the age of accountability. And they usually mark that at about 12 or 13, when a person was finally able to make moral and ethical decisions, understanding what those decisions were. They were leaving childhood and they were becoming an adult. And so Aquinas has been very influential in some ways on both Catholics and Protestants, and his theology is often held in tension in some ways with Augustine's theology. It's a softer view than Augustine's view, certainly softer than Calvin's.
Just real quick, we have about 7 minutes left, and typically we like to wrap up after an hour. How do you feel about going into about 10 minutes of overtime to answer some of these questions?
I will go into.
We have about 4 or 5 that are coming in that are really good questions.
They're good questions, and if y'all will hang with me, I will get to those. Let me.
This is a treat. This is overtime that we
really
don't normally get.
This is great. Thank you for your questions. Hold those questions. I'm going to also very quickly, because this will produce a whole other set of questions, talk about the ancestral interpretation of Genesis 3. Now, Caden Edwards, who runs sound and lights for us on Sunday mornings, Caden is a spiritual seeker, if there ever has been one put in this world. And he's been auditing some Eastern Orthodoxy courses of late. I've enjoyed my conversation with him. I jokingly said to him, I need you on the front row Wednesday night because I'm going to defer to you. Caden may chime in here in just a second on this because I can't get into all of the details. But the ancestral view of the fall, and we'll go to slide 12 there, is a position held by Eastern Orthodoxy. The Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church speaking Latin, and the Eastern Church, Orthodoxy speaking Greek, split in 1054. But they were already miles apart before that split. And the main theological difference between Catholicism and I would say Calvinistic reformism and the Eastern Church is that the Eastern Church, while accepting St. Augustine as a saint and a great man in the history of the church, they outright reject the theology of Augustine. The Eastern Orthodox Church does not have an Augustinian view of the fall or original sin. And because they begin at a different place, they end up at a different destination. They don't believe in original guilt. They're different on the atonement. There's no penal substitution. There's no predestination. Not on the nature of being human. They're all different. The ancestral view is that, yes, you inherited sin. It's your ancestry, but it's just a part of what it means to be a human being. And being a human being is not a crime unto itself. Like Aquinas, and it's really interesting here that Aquinas was a Greek speaker, and I wonder how much theology changes based simply upon the language that is your native language. But their view sees sin as a wound that only God can heal. But in that healing, they also believe that human beings can rise to a place higher than anything in Protestantism or Roman Catholicism can even imagine. They call the process theosis, whereby a person gains union with God through the incarnation and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if you go and you look at Eastern Orthodoxy iconography, they have icons everywhere. Almost every time you see Jesus post-resurrection coming out of the grave, he is reaching through the gates of hell. He has the keys to the gates of hell and death. And he's pulling Adam and Eve out of hell. That is a major theological construct in Eastern Orthodoxy, completely redeeming humanity, beginning with our spiritual ancestors, Adam and Eve. Eve Tibbs says it like this: sin is not the enemy in the same way the Western Church treats it. Sin simply is. Death is the real enemy that Christ in the incarnation came to overcome. So the view of Eastern Orthodoxy is very, very different than what you see with Calvin or what you see with Augustine or even Aquinas. It is a radically new and different animal, and it's pretty liberating for those who grew up in the West. There's some other final ramifications from Genesis chapter 3, and then I'm going to take your questions. I have 2 minutes to do the ramifications, and then from there, humans are cast out into the world. In Genesis, at the end of Genesis chapter 3, this is the leading Jewish position, because the Jewish position is that Eden was above the earth, outside the earth, so a heavenly paradise. So this fall is literally that, a fall crashing to the earth. If you move into Genesis 4, the first significant thing that happens after the fall is a murder. Cain murders his brother Abel out of envy and jealousy, the human condition shown immediately by the Hebrew writers. But then just as immediately, Adam and Eve have another child, Seth. And every time a baby is born in this fallen world, it is an act of hope and resistance against death. And I think the Hebrew writers want to show that as well. And then chapter 5 is a genealogy. It's the first of more than a half a dozen given in this book. And this I have to answer this question from the very first week. What about these long lifetimes? Everybody in these genealogies are living like forever, hundreds of years. What do you make of that? I don't think they're literal. They're symbolic. And you've got a slide here, and I'll commend it to you, that if you add up the ages at death of the patriarchs, from Adam to Moses, there's 26 of them. If you add them up, you come to 12,600 years. This is the same figure picked up by the writer of Daniel and the writer of Revelation, with a zero dropped 1,260 days. It's also the same number found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the exact number of days that the writer of the Dead Sea Scrolls says that the sons of light and the sons of darkness will be at war with each other for 12,600 days. It is an apocalyptic number. The original listeners would have known that. A lot of this has been lost to us, but I think this first genealogy is a bit of, and I think I can say this without being cute, it's a bit of a Mayan calendar doomsday clock written into the text. Before Garrett came over here, I've been studying on this all day, and I laid down on the couch and fell asleep, and I think this answer came to me in my dream. I haven't verified this with any other commentary scholar or whatever, but I had a dream for just a minute about King Josiah. We have that last slide. King Josiah was the last faithful and competent king of Judah before the destruction of Jerusalem. In the 18th year of his reign, a Torah was discovered in the temple. And I'll read directly from 2 Kings 22. When the king heard what was written in the book of the law, he tore his clothes in despair. Then he gave these orders to the priest: "Go to the temple and speak to the Lord for me and for the people and for all Judah. Inquire about the words written in the scroll that has been found. For the Lord's great anger is burning against us because our ancestors have not obeyed the words of this scroll. We have not been doing everything it says we must do." Remember my hypothesis about the composition of Genesis, that it came together after the exile, a document for the survivors who have faced an extinction event. From the discovery of the Torah scroll in 621 BC by Josiah to the destruction of the Jewish temple in 586 is 12,600 days. And I think this genealogy is a reminder and a countdown of the time between the revival to embrace the Word of God and the law of God and the utter destruction of the land. I can't verify that. I don't know if anybody can, but that's pretty little novel insight that I had today. So to these questions, real quick.
All right, we are kicking off overtime. So let's just start with this first one that I'm seeing here. I think it was going back to the either Aquinian interpretation or the ancestral interpretation. Did you say that they saw sin as more of a wound than a weakness?
Wound and weakness.
Okay.
Both the ancestral view and the Aquinian view would be the same in that regard. They don't see it as the death nail that Augustine sees it as.
Okay.
They would certainly agree the wages of sin is death, but they would not see it as total depravity in the Augustine use or the John Calvin use of that word.
Okay. And Kevin had made a comment that said, "My understanding of free will is that mankind gave that up to the bonds of sin at the fall. We have freedom of choice, in which are the consequences of that." Clarification on that?
That's a wise. I mean, that's pretty wise insight. Now Augustine would say that the fall so corrupted our ability to choose, that we can only choose the bad. That's the Augustine position. Aquinas and others would say, no, by God's grace, we can choose right. We still have a degree of free will. It's a debated topic, but I don't think any of us should be confident in our decision making all the time, for sure. That it is a requirement of grace that our decisions, we have the Spirit within us to guide us on our way. That's a great insight. But again, Augustine would say, impossible. It's just impossible. You can't make a good decision because you're depraved. And Aquinas would say, you still have your reason and you still have your desire for God. That has to count for something.
Yeah, and I think some theologians I know and often read would argue that we have ultimate free will, and it is not simply a consequence of which bad choice are we going to make, which sinful choice are we going to make. We ultimately, God leaves that up to us.
And then and it's a whole different theological discussion, but you're getting into the difference between Augustinian theology and Arminian theology,
which we've talked about.
Arminian, named after Arminius, is the theological belief in free will. It's prevalent in a lot of Baptist, Wesleyan traditions, Methodist traditions, certainly in the Disciples and some Church of Christ, not all, but in the non-Calvin Protestantism, you find a lot of open free will belief.
Would Calvin say there was an actual Adam and Eve?
Calvin has to say there is an actual Adam and Eve, as Augustine said there is an actual Adam and Eve. Their hypothesis, their interpretation of original sin and the fall requires a literal Adam and Eve. The ancestral view and the allegorical view do not require a literal Adam and Eve.
Well, and it's just it's literal biblical perspective across the board. Yeah,
right.
Yeah. And Susan asked a great question. So if sin is spread through sperm, why do so many preachers identify Eve, women, as the source of sin, eating the apple? Is this misogyny or something else? That's a great question.
It's a great question. It's misogyny. It's Adam passes the sin along, but it's Eve's fault as the weaker vessel, which is a phrase that
the woman made me do it.
Which is a phrase that has its roots in the New Testament, a Pauline view. Paul didn't go as far as Augustine did. That sounds crazy to say that I just said that out loud. But Paul did not go as far as Augustine in his writing about original sin. He never even really uses that phrase, but the fall. And he didn't go as far as Augustine did in regard to women.
And to kind of piggyback off of your earlier recommendation of Genesis for Normal People, Pete Enns writes a book called The Evolution of Adam, which makes that distinction and connection of what Paul talks about with Adam and original sin and the seed and all that stuff.
I haven't read that.
I've read it and I don't remember half of it because it was pretty deep. Let's see. Mark said, if the story of Adam and Eve in chapter 3 are just figurative people, who is the Adam and Eve in chapter 4? They seem real. They're having Cain and Abel.
Right. Again, Genesis 1 through 11 is unto itself different than any biblical passage anywhere in the Old or New Testament canon. And those who take an allegorical view maintain Adam and Eve. In fact, they maintain Genesis 1 through 11 as allegorical. that you do not get to history until Abraham arrives. That is the allegorical view. Much of the Jewish view, many Christians view it that way, and a large number of Eastern Orthodox take that view. Some Roman Catholics and some Protestants take that view. But in our country, in our religious landscape, both Protestant and Catholic, we tend to view Genesis 1 through 11 as more literal. And again, we haven't embraced the last 150 years of textual criticisms to that effect.
And in large part of that is due from Calvin's writings.
Calvin,
much of what we have today is largely influenced by Calvin.
right? And I don't want to discount either that
Augustine.
right. And I don't want to discount either that Martin Luther was an Augustinian
Yeah.
monk.
Yeah.
I mean, both the two leading reformers of the 1500s, Martin Luther and John Calvin, were Augustinian to their toenails. And while they rebuked the Catholic Church's abuses, some of its structure, that a big problem with the Pope. And they talked a lot about salvation by faith through grace alone. They still kept the Augustinian theological structure. And it prevailed to this day.
And we have one last question here that we can see. So from a historical perspective, Augustine's view reflect early Christian thought on original sin, and Aquinas' view represents medieval developments in Christian thought on original sin?
That's a good question. I would only amend it to say this, that Augustine's view is the first institutional view of original sin, and that Aquinas is the medieval adaptation of it. In the first 400 years of the church, the fall was not even a theological issue.
Was it Origen?
Origen
that had more of non what's the word I'm looking for? Non-original sin perspective.
Right. Origen 135, so he's the 2nd century. He was a universalist, first of all.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he believed that the power of Christ would save all. That was not an aberrant view at the time, but by the time...
That was pretty well accepted.
It was widespread
time.
in the church fathers, particularly in the Greek church fathers. Augustine codifies and establishes the institutional view of original sin. So he doesn't invent original sin, but he is definitely the curator and the one who institutionalizes it. Before him, there is not one mention of the fall in any of the great ecumenical creeds of the church.
Which is really fascinating.
It is fascinating.
Because, going back to your history of Christianity, there was a lot happening from the time of Jesus until Constantine, 300. So this even happens, Augustine's perspective happens after Constantine, after it's established. Well, but everything had already gone to ruin for the Christianity prior to that. So it's odd that he would have that particular perspective.
Right.
Sorry, we're going into ultra overtime now.
What
that
time
he would
is
have
it?
that.
Okay. We're going to go 2 more minutes.
Yeah, that he would have that perspective after it's already a thing, versus when it was, it would make more sense for that to have been an established thought and creed beforehand because of what was happening to Christians. We have to have a reason for all this.
But see, the fall, as we call it, Jewish believers were not obsessed with it. Thus, the first Christians were not, because they were Jews. And even when they became predominantly Gentiles, they weren't obsessed with it. The Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Chalcedonian Creed, all of the ecumenical creeds, never a mention of the fall. It just was not a theological issue. It was just accepted that sin is.
Yeah.
And then back to Augustine, Augustine is creating his theology at a time where Rome is falling apart, and the bishops are now having to become the administrators over towns, and the priests are having to become like local elected officials. The Roman Church begins to replace the Roman Empire, and you can't do that without hard structure and law, and Augustine provided
and this
that.
massively affects the medieval thought of Christianity and the need for a savior, grace, and
All of it.
depth of depravity, and it's used and weaponized in this crazy
To
way.
quote my friend Landon Saunders over and over again, what you start with, where you start, determines where you end up. And if you start purely with Augustine, then all these other issues are required to solve the problem of original sin. The Eastern Church does not start there. The ancestral view does not start there.
They're happy
Excuse me,
people.
the allegorical view doesn't start there. And so they arrive at different conclusions because they begin with a different premise.
Yeah.
That's enough of that. We're 15 minutes over time.
I
so
love what
stop.
Sarah said here, though. This is great. It seems that my beliefs are much like a patchwork quilt. We're
Amen
all
and
there.
amen, Sarah Brunson. That is the amen of it all. Absolutely.
Happening next week?
Happening next week, we'll move on to the story of the flood and Noah, and that is in chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. We may even grab part of 10 as well. But we'll see you next week, God willing, in person at A Simple Faith at 6:30. Thank you in there. Y'all have a great night.